Okay, great. Welcome back from your nap or walk. We hope to have a wonderful discussion here to end our afternoon. As Jim said, I'm Lynn Jeffries. I'm from the North Carolina chapter of this great organization. Happy to moderate and help out today. The first thing I would like to do is to ask if Jerry has a question for Ralph or if Ralph has a question for Jerry.
Well, one question. Can you say a little bit more about the role of law, since you've been involved in some lawsuits related to the plant and what is, and sometimes you make a necessity defense, I think, in this. But you've also, I think my understanding through those lawsuits. Oh, okay. My question is what role law plays in this?
Well, not a big enough role. And I mean, it depends on this venue that you're looking at, but in the United States, it's very difficult for us to find a venue, a courtroom, where a judge is willing to actually look for some kind of a justice or a weighing of the balanced scales of justice. And judges feel, and I think maybe appropriately so, that their hands are tied by the precedents that have been passed in the past. In the international arena, the International Court of Justice has good rulings. The opinion that they did in 1996 on nuclear weapons, the court was divided, but it was decided by Judge Weir-Montary's deciding vote that the use or threat of use of nuclear weapons would commonly be understood as a violation of common humanitarian law. And further, they ruled that the nuclear weapons states that promised in 1970 in the Non-Proliferation Treaty that they would make a good faith effort to enter into negotiations to achieve disarmament at an early date. And the court ruled in 1996 it was time to fish or cut bait. They said you have an obligation to achieve disarmament, not just to negotiate. In this country, though, the legal challenges mostly happen via actions that activists take, like the Plowshares actions in particular. And in those actions, oftentimes they go to federal court and they attempt to use a defense like a necessity defense to say that yes, we broke a law. It was not as big as the law what we were trying to preserve, which is human life. And the courts won't hear that. They regularly disallow the necessity defense. Interestingly, the current Plowshares case, which will go on trial next month in Kings Bay, Georgia, was the first time that the defendants have spread blood and did a Plowshares action there. And the judge, first the magistrate heard them and ruled against them, and they appealed to the judge who heard them and ruled against them on August 7th. But in both the magistrate and the judge's case, the prosecution, of course, said, well, that was just a charade. They were just doing that to get on there. And the judge said, I find their beliefs to be, number one, they are religious. Number two, they are sincerely held. But ruled against them on the third criteria, which the government has the right to use the least restrictive means possible. And so in both cases, the judges ruled against them. So I would say that the state of courts in this country, trying to use the law to overcome nuclear weapons is not likely to be successful. It could very well, though, be a venue that brings attention to the issue that people pay attention to. And so if you think of it as an organizing tool, if you think it as part of the activist toolbox, yes. If you think of it as an effective way to bring an end to nuclear weapons production in this country, we're not there at this point with our federal courts.
Thank you.
So I have a question for you. I've spent a lot of time on the streets demonstrating sort of from outside the system, trying to call it to account, but we also go and lobby in Congress and stuff like that. But I've been on federal advisory committees and on some state advisory panels as well, so sort of from inside the process. And my question for you, not only your own experience, but the other things that you talked about is how do you sort of negotiate being in this discussion without validating the fundamental premise?
Yeah. Well, that's a good question. And that would come up in terms of how we would argue for example, U.S. should ratify the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, which is a really important treaty. And as you mentioned, the U.S. is abiding by that treaty, even though it hasn't ratified it. But one question we had in drafting the letter that you send the members of the Senate is, do you lay out the whole position, which is that deterrence is only morally acceptable, if ever, in the interim, but we should be moving toward global nuclear disarmament. Therefore, we need to ratify the comprehensive test ban as a step toward global nuclear disarmament. And a lot of the advocacy groups would say, please don't say that. Don't talk about global nuclear disarmament, because then they'll think you're being utopian and idealistic and all that. Just focus on the treaty as being a good thing for today, and not as don't mention that it's a step toward disarmament, because most senators are not going to see that as a reason. They're going to see that as a reason not to sign the treaty, because that's one of the arguments against the treaty is we sign the treaty and pretty soon we're going to have to get rid of our weapons because they won't be reliable and et cetera. And they'll keep us from modernizing and keeping up with the Russians and the Chinese. So that's where you run into that's one area.
Conflict, yeah.
Is how much of the argument do you make? And it's just a practical judgment call that you have to know your audience, as you said. And if you know your audience is not going to buy the argument, then maybe you gotta just present the parts of the argument that you think they'll agree with.
Thank you. I get to ask the first question, sorry. My question is that feeling the frustration and impatience of the whole situation, what are your suggestions, since the people in the room that have the conversations are the people that have the power, and we're having a conversation but I'm feeling not so confident about the power? How can we help ourselves feel a little bit more powerful in such a big situation here? Either one of you?
Isn't this the Catholic Committee on Appalachia?
I believe so.
Don't we think we sort of have God on our side?
Oh, well, I know that.
Shouldn't we be feeling the power? This is something that I struggle with. In fact, I'll make an advertisement that when we do the little talent show tonight, I'm going to sing 2 songs, and this is exactly what they're going to be about. Because I've been doing this for my adult life, and we're still talking about a lot of the things that we were talking about when I started doing this work. And I think that, but I knew when I signed up that it was a long haul kind of a thing. I knew this wasn't a quick win, but now I look at my children, and this has been part of their lives. My oldest daughter's 24. This has been part of their lives since day one, and I'm leaving them pretty much where they started. So I think the challenge for us is to think about new ways to, we have some new tools. We have a ban treaty coming into effect when it gets a few more ratifications. New ways to leverage with the tools that we have. I think it's important. We now live in a global world. When a 13-year-old from Sweden, Greta Thunberg,
Yes.
and she can galvanize young people around the world on an issue. We live in a global world where our movements have to go global. We have to draw strength from where people are more active than we are, and build global collaborations. And I see those things starting to happen, so that gives me a little bit of hope. It doesn't mean that we're there yet in terms of knowing how to exercise this power, but in terms of the raw political power, more people want to get rid of nuclear weapons in the world than want the 9 nuclear states to continue to maintain their huge stockpiles. And I think that has to win someday. I think we have to be careful not to be too patient about that.
I find myself being angry more when I read the paper than I was when I was in Washington. And why is that? Because when I was in Washington, I read the paper, I knew I could go to work the next day, and I was working on a bunch of the issues that were on the front page of the paper that were making me unhappy. And I also knew that there were lots of good folks in Washington, members of Congress, people at the State Department, White House, whatever, who the administration is, who we're also, trying to make positive change. So because I was more on the inside of some of these Washington debates, I felt like I could do something, and two, I knew that even if we weren't doing something, I couldn't do anything through my work at the Bishops' Conference, that there were other people in town who were on top of this issue. Now I'm in academia, and I feel like I'm not working on all these issues every day, so I feel a little more impatient and ineffective and angry. The good news is, I think that because this is back to being an elite debate, you can actually have more impact. Because a little bit of democratization of the nuclear debate can have more impact because there's so little going on. So I would focus right now on the New START treaty, just in terms of advocacy. That the U.S. and Russia need to decide whether they're going to continue this treaty for another 5 years and maybe begin negotiations on deeper cuts. That seems unlikely. But there's a lot of support in Congress for continuing the START treaty beyond 2021, early 2021, when it's due to expire. And if those members of Congress, if you're a member of Congress here in this area, I don't know who that is, but especially your senator, if your senators from Tennessee get a couple hundred letters about extend START, they're going to pay attention to that because they're not getting any letters on nuclear, hardly any letters on nuclear questions. And so if they get a couple hundred from Tennessee, all of a sudden that gets on their radar screen at least a little bit. So I think, and I don't do social media, but I am impressed with how ordinary people sitting in the basement at 2 in.the morning can generate a lot of activity and a lot of attention to issues, and so those are some very. It doesn't take much to write a letter or to get everybody here to write a letter on, say, the New START treaty extension, and believe me that a little bit of activity will get people to pay attention, because members of Congress do pay attention to their constituents. That's number one. They pay attention to their constituents.
Do you think Trump goes down in the basement at 2 o'clock in the morning?
Okay. Please remember to wait for the mic. Jeannie's going to run around the room. So who would like to ask the first question? Here? Vincent.
Can I ask a question kind of about linking up our conversations about nuclear weapons and war in general? It's 2019, and for those of us who teach either high school or even college students, our students haven't existed in a world where the United States hasn't been at war.
Right.
Their whole lives we've been at war, in at least Afghanistan, and also Iraq and Syria and the rest. And there's no anti-war movement of note. So when we say there's no nuclear disarmament awareness, it's not alone. And even under President Bush, when we went into Iraq, it seemed like there was a lively anti-war movement that under the previous administration and continuing now is gone. I just am curious your all's perspectives about if those two kind of absences of awareness are related.
Absolutely. All you have to do is institute the draft, and you will have an anti-war movement. I think that's the reality. I'm not supportive of the draft myself. The U.S. bishops have opposed registration for the draft, but I think that's just a fact of life. That if you want an anti-war movement, have a draft. Then you would have a very strong anti-war movement in the millisecond. I hate to say it, but I'm just afraid, you might, I don't know what's going to take to revive the anti-nuclear movement of anything like the early 1980s movement or in the early 60s with the test ban movement. But I hope it's not that somebody uses nuclear weapons, I'm afraid it could take that, but I hope it doesn't take that. I hope that with the confluence of forces right now, where we have an administration that seems to be against all arms control agreements, and right now there's only one left that well, they're more multilateral. One bilateral left. That's the START agreement between U.S. and Russia. So if you eliminate if you end those bilateral agreements, plus you've got the biggest nuclear buildup since the early 1980s, plus you have an administration that is, and a president is sometimes, involved in bellicose rantings about, demolishing other countries like North Korea, which means using nukes. Maybe all of that together could help revive the movement. But in the meantime, there's plenty that can be done, mostly at the elite level, but not only, we're doing a regular weekly institute now for students from Catholic universities around the country on nukes, just to try to because we recognize you got to get the next generation. So you can teach about it in high school. I'm sure hardly any high schools, they're teaching about Catholic social teaching and the like, but they're not teaching about nukes, I don't think, for the most part. So, we're doing that long, slow process of trying to get urging more academics to teach about nukes in their classes. We're actually doing our own summer institutes for nukes every year in Washington where we're recruiting. So if you know any students, let me know. And you can do that in your high school if you're a teacher. Just add it to the curriculum unless you're restricted and can't. But you got to have a long-term. Wherever you have to have a long-term educational project in order to develop a new generation of people who care about this. And young people do get excited about the issue once they learn about it. So believe me, when we took 25 students from Georgetown, Notre Dame, and Catholic University to the Vatican conference, some of them said, yeah, it's a really important issue, but it's just not my issue. I don't want to deal with hardware, all this nuclear deterrence stuff. But a bunch of students said, I want to do this. And they got we helped them get internships at arms control organizations, and some at the Vatican started work. We got them internships at the Vatican to work on nukes. So, it's a slow process, but I'm hopeful that we can slowly recruit more people into. And you don't need everybody. You just need a core of educated people, a core of bishops who we're also trying to, help develop a new group of younger bishops who, know enough about the issue that they can address it in a serious way. So we're working lots of things.
Thank you.
So
Did you
could I
say
just follow up on that?
Yeah.
So I think one of the things that's important to do now is for us to battle the cynicism that's in young people. Even if you're teaching, they're not old enough to be cynical yet. They have to look like us. They can be more cynical. But when George W. Bush was in the run-up to the Iraq War, there was a pretty strong anti-war movement in this country. I remember going to a vigil in Knoxville, and I had all the signs in the trunk of the car, but I had to take my kids to violin lessons. So we stopped. It was February. It was cold. It was raining, and we met Carol Nickel at the mall parking lot, and I dumped off all the signs, and then I went to the violin lesson. On the way back, I thought we'll stop by and pick up the signs of the 10 or 12 people who were there and take them home with us. And we pulled around the curve heading there, and there were 800 people standing in the freezing rain in Knoxville, Tennessee. That had never happened before, never. There were millions of people on the streets in the United States that weekend in February. 6 weeks later, we went to war in Iraq. I think the anti-war movement learned at that moment that it didn't matter. Their government, Democrats and Republicans, supported that war, no matter what Joe Biden is saying now, supported it full-throated, no matter what their constituents wanted, no matter what the people in this country wanted. And this other side of that is that we have a culture of violence in the United States. Steve Leeper from the Hiroshima Peace Cultural Foundation came over to talk with us about that once. Japan has Article 9 in their constitution that forbids them from having a standing army. And he, having lived there most of his life, first as a child of missionaries, then as an adult, was able to reflect on what's the difference between living in a culture of violence and a culture of peace. And I don't think that we even face that in this country. right now there's 100,000 people at a football stadium in Chattanooga cheering on one of the most violent things that we do. It's called a sport, but it's not recreation anymore. It's not recreating people's energy and emotions and stuff. It's just a brutal sport, this football is, and it's not as brutal as boxing and hockey and those kind of things. But we celebrate it big time in this country, and every soldier that comes home gets a picture of his little daughter running up and jumping into his hands at the airport or whatever, and we celebrate that. We have parades for killing, because in a culture of violence, that's what it finally is saying. If we disagree with you, we might use diplomacy, we might do all kinds of things to come to an agreement, but finally, in the end, we're going to kill you. That's what we have our army for. So I think if you want to rebuild these movements, you can start at the very basic level, especially with young people, to talk about what it means to live in a culture of nonviolence and how to use tools of nonviolence in our daily lives, which doesn't happen very often in our schools. And I'll just stop there.
Thank you. Right here.
Yeah, Ralph, you talked about how people involved in civil disobedience are trying to defend against it, as far as the law is concerned. Would you talk a little bit more about the kind of work that OREPA is doing legally, like, for instance, challenging inadequate environmental impact statements and other things?
Yes, thank you, Rita. So when the Department of Energy announced in 2005 that they were going to build the next nuclear bomb plant in the United States in Oak Ridge to replace the one that was built in the Manhattan Project, we resolved, obviously, OREPA would resolve to oppose it. So I'm glad to say that 14 years later they haven't built the uranium processing facility bomb plant, but we, I guess 3.5 years ago, we realized that we had exhausted every possible means of stopping the bomb plant. It not only had its momentum, but Lamar Alexander, those of you who are Tennesseans know that he's our senator, and he chairs the Energy and Water Development Subcommittee, which means he funds every Department of Energy project in this country. Building a dam, doing some project on the river, building a nuclear bomb plant. So the fix was in on the UPF bomb plant for Oak Ridge, Tennessee, as long as Lamar is the chair of that committee. But what we noticed was a couple of times the project almost collapsed because the cost estimates went so high. It showed me two things. One is we don't need that bomb plant for security or any other purposes. If we needed a bomb plant for the security of this country, there wouldn't be too high of a price tag. The Pentagon spends hundreds of billions of dollars a year, and a little $20 billion spread out over 10 years in Oak Ridge is a drop in the bucket. But it was too much for Lamar to say he can build his bomb plant. So we don't need that bomb plant, and if we can delay the construction long enough, it once again will collapse of its own financial weight. So finally we came to the court of last resort, which was to litigate in federal court. And we did a grassroots fundraising campaign online, sort of our own in-house GoFundMe, and we raised as much in a month as we usually are able to raise in a year for our work. So we had an enormous response from people and some people from Canada, people we'd never heard of because that's how social media fundraising works, that got us into federal court. We happen to have absolutely superb lawyers in Washington, D.C. who were willing to cap their fee at $50,000 for us, which was about a fifth of what we thought we would have to pay for a successful lawsuit. So we're very hopeful. We are in federal court in Knoxville right now. The case is assigned to Judge Pamela Reeves, who is the chief judge of the district. One of our members was in college with her when they were both members of Greenpeace. Fingers crossed. If the judge rules according to the law in its purest form, we will win easily. But if she defers to the federal agency, which judges often do, then we won't win. So I do think there's a use of the courts to litigate on these procedural matters. I don't think we can be terribly optimistic about it. It's a huge gamble because it's pretty expensive. And it depends a lot on the venue that you get to do that. So we're sort of waiting to see what happens with this. If we win the lawsuit, all we win is, we hope, she vacates their environmental impact statement because it's utterly and completely bogus, and makes them do another one, and stops construction while they do that. And then we get another hearing, and we call everybody to come to Oak Ridge and speak at the environmental impact statement hearing when it happens. So we'll see. I mean, it's not, if we win, it's not like a done deal. It's like we've just rolled back the process to start over again.
Thank you. This side? Hang on 1 second.
Do you see a relationship between climate disruption, let's call it, let's not euphemistically call it climate change? Do you see a connection with that and the excess money being thrown around by the nuclear industry?
The nuclear energy industry or the nuclear weapons industry?
It's all connected. When you have a reactor for generating electricity, the byproduct is fissionable material for making bombs.
Yeah.
And I think there's a collusion between electrical generation and nuclear war.
Well, one challenge is that, one solution, not the only one, but one solution to climate change disruption is nuclear energy. And so if countries in sub-Saharan Africa, for example, or the Middle East or Asia decide that, okay, we're not going to do coal-fired power plants, we're going to follow France's example and rely heavily on nuclear energy, peaceful nuclear energy is permitted under the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and that'll be our contribution to, avoiding worsening the climate disruption problem. Well, that exacerbates many times over the nuclear proliferation problem because the International Agency for Atomic Energy simply doesn't have the resources or the capacity to monitor nuclear power plants, peaceful nuclear energy throughout the world. Right now it's limited, relatively limited to a relatively small number of countries, and so they can, arguably keep track of all this material, but the more it spreads around the world, the more likely you're going to just exacerbate nuclear proliferation and also make it easier for terrorist groups or other non-state actors to get nukes. So that's one connection. That's one connection that's definitely there.
Thank you.
And that risk is actually one of the reasons why I think Nunn and Kissinger and all those people have spoken out so strongly for disarming nuclear weapons. It's simply the presence of so much fissile material that increases the odds of even someone making a dirty bomb, which could still have devastating consequences. So I guess the other connection I would make, of course, the nuclear industry, I think, has no scruples whatsoever, and they will use any excuse to try to get money for their next project. And the nuclear industry, between the bomb building and the commercial power, the contractors is the link, the corporations that are profiting on both sides of this and that are equally refusing to take responsibility for the waste product that comes out the other end. That's also a link, I think, that connects the so-called peaceful use of nuclear power with the military use of nuclear materials for weapons purposes.
So we're trying to, I think, especially with young people, but also with trying to get scholars interested in the nuclear question again. We think that connecting it to the environmental issue is really helpful because all young people I know are interested in the climate issue and environmental issues. There's a lot of interest. So we committed to using one of our year-long full-time fellowships for visiting faculty to invite faculty to address the question of Catholic approaches to peace, disarmament, sustainable development, and climate change. And we got a total of 3 applicants. Normally we get about 50 applicants for those positions. We got 3. We did have 2, and none of the 3 actually addressed the question. So it just and so now this year we're not even going to advertise for that anymore because we know we won't get anybody. So we're just going to do climate change, and we're going to keep nukes out of it. So it's just hard to get, it just reinforces the need for our project, which is we can't even get the scholars when we're offering them a year at Notre Dame. We're paying them a lot of money and they just aren't willing to come to address the question because it's not one of their areas of focus. They got other priorities. So it's a frustration that we have at the moment. They're making this climate change disarmament connection. And the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists does it very explicitly. So there are some people who are doing it, but we haven't quite figured out how to get more Catholic scholars to focus on that question.
Are there corporations or private sectors involved with the creation or the promotion of nuclear bombs that you might have a list of or we might know of that we could then make our voices by supporting them or not supporting them?
There's an OREPA newsletter back on that table in front of our little board there, which says, "Are you investing in bombs?" And that's exactly what the lead article is about. It names the top 10 financial institutions in this country that are underwriting the top 18 corporations that are involved in nuclear weapons work. The Oak Ridge Environmental Peace Alliance, I have the Alliance for Nuclear Accountability that we're part of has a credit card that's issued by Bank of America. Bank of America is one of those corporations. So I wrote a letter to the president of Bank of America, because this year I happen to be president of ANA. We didn't hear back, but our first step was to write a letter to him asking him about this. And our second step will be to find an alternate carrier for a credit card, if we can find one that has cleaner hands than that. I have a working assets credit card that I've had for 15 years. Bank of America issued the working assets credit card. So I got online and wrote to Working Assets. This is an organization that dedicates 5 cents every time I use my credit card. They give 5 cents to a good cause. I get to vote on which cause. No answer from Working Assets at this point. So I do think it's a great way to, we did a Sunday vigil, and the first thing I said was, everybody take out your wallets and let's see how connected we are. And most of us were connected. Something we had no idea of, but you'll get that information you're asking for there, and it will also give you the link to Don't Bank on the Bomb, which is the international effort to address the funding for nuclear weapons.
Good, thank you. Over here?
I'm backtracking a little bit, but right before the Iraq War, we had a discussion at my parish. Of course, we live right next to Lockheed Martin, so it was a community that was heavily invested in Benson Street. But it was led by a couple sisters, and I remembered that I kept hearing around the room, well, so-and-so is saying that they have weapons of mass destruction, so we have to listen to that and follow what they're telling us. And I'm just wondering if anybody feels like that is part of the problem in the faith community, that we tend to not question authority, or even in the U.S. And if that's changing with younger generations, or if anybody can speak to that, because I don't know. I just got the sense that that was a big part. That is a big part of the problem.
I don't know. I mean, back in the run-up to the Gulf War, I was skeptical of the official voices from Washington, and it may have been just my personal biases, but when Scott Ritter came to Knoxville, and he was on the IAEA team that went in and disarmed Saddam Hussein and destroyed the nuclear stuff in the mid-90s, when he came to Knoxville, he said, they're not there, they're not going to find him there. I've been there. We saw what he had. We got rid of it. And time proved him to be completely true. But I didn't have any problem believing him. Of course, that's what I wanted to believe, too, at the time. He just seemed to be very credible. If I were a young person today, I mean, I have 2 kids. I have no idea how they sort out what is true and what's not true from the incredible volume of information that comes to them on the screens that they seem to be wed to on a regular basis. The only thing I can say is that when I have conversations with my oldest daughter, she's very smart and she gets it. And she's not bamboozled by stuff. But there are a lot of people, I mean, I don't know how they filter the information that is coming to them, because certainly when I was that age, I was clueless.
You know, during the Iraq, before that debate on Iraq, or during the debate in Iraq, some in the Catholic community, like, I won't name any names, but George Weigel and the U.S. ambassador to the Holy See at the time,
Good. He's right, he won't name his name.
anyway, they made the argument that under the proper use of the just war tradition, we have a responsibility, certainly the bishops, church leaders have a responsibility to defer to the judgment of the public authorities. And so we had an internal, debate. It wasn't a huge debate, but we had an internal debate at the Bishops' Conference about that. Unfortunately, that argument did not win out. The bishops said what they thought, based on, and they always have a caveat that based on the information available to us, we find that it would be morally problematic to intervene in Iraq. But there are some who, like people like George Weigel, who were arguing that no, you should just defer to the authorities. But I don't think that's an appropriate reading of not only the role of the bishops or the Vatican, but I also don't think for citizens of the United States we have an obligation to defer to claims made by. We have to do our best to investigate those claims. We can't just say we don't believe you. You've got to say why you don't. And it's hard because they always hide behind intelligence.
Right.
They always say we have more information than you do, and they do. They really do. But in this case, there were lots of voices at the time, like Ritter, like one of my colleagues, George Lopez at the Kroc Institute, Notre Dame, who were writing in major publications like Foreign Affairs, saying there are no weapons of mass destruction, and they had credibility for various reasons, mostly because these people had all been involved in monitoring sanctions against Iraq for more than a decade. But my bottom line is we have to question the authorities. We have to do it in a serious way. We have to be informed. But we can't just, this idea that we simply have to defer to the authorities on matters as important as war, that's exactly why we should defer to them, because it is the most consequential decision any president or member of Congress makes, is to unleash the world's most powerful military in war.
And I think one other way it occurs to me that we should exercise that responsibility to use our judgment is we have learned since the beginning of the Iraq War, with the stuff that happened at Guantanamo and the prisoners that were taken there who turned out to be a mistaken identity or had no information. Not only what we learned on the surface of it going into the Gulf War was that the intelligence was cooked to serve whatever the politicians wanted. But the reality is a lot of the intelligence is cooked before our intelligence agencies ever get it. So people offered up their neighbors or somebody they had a grudge with as a member of the jihad, just because that was a convenient way to get rid of them and claim some reward money, and off they went to Guantanamo with no basis for fact. So I think when it comes to that, we not only have a right, but we have a deep responsibility to be deeply skeptical of what we hear.
This side? Marcus? Wait 1 second.
I may be going a little backward, maybe 15 minutes ago, Jerry. You seem to have intimated some of the things that I'm interested in hearing about, but I'd like a little more focus maybe on what you do and your group do on revitalizing Catholic involvement in all these questions. Like 1, 2, 3, 4,
Okay.
5, 6, 7.
So real quick, so part of it is trying to get the next generation of students, young people involved. So I just mentioned we've started this week-long institute in Washington that we do with Georgetown, and I think this year the Bishops' Conference will co-sponsor it, possibly Catholic University. And two, we are planning to do like a curriculum module for universities so that professors who aren't currently teaching about this in their class can easily, incorporate 1 or 2 or 3, 4 class session module on the question. So we're going to develop those materials and spread them around. We at the Kroc Institute, we paid for 2 students, 1 master's level, 1 undergrad, to do a summer internship at ICANN in Geneva, which won the Nobel Prize, as was mentioned. And we've helped lots of other students get internships. Like one of my students got an internship at the Holy See mission that's dealing with nuclear weapons in Vienna and Geneva. Another just finished an internship at the Holy See mission to the UN, and part of her job was working on nuclear weapons. Another was at the Arms Control Association, and that led to a full-time job working on nuclear issues for the Friends Committee on National Legislation, which is one of the most effective faith-based groups dealing with this issue on Capitol Hill. And notice those are all women. Virtually all the internship people I've helped get internships are women. So that's going to be an interesting and helpful change if these people stay in it, because there haven't been that many women involved in nuclear issues. So that's the student piece. On the scholars piece, we've got 3 publications coming out soon. One is and Father Drew Christensen, who I used to work with at the Bishops' Conference, is now at Georgetown. He is working with the Vatican to publish the talks that were given at the Vatican Conference in 2017. And so that the Vatican's kind of relying on us to help them get that out. And once they get those out, they're probably going to send some Vatican officials around to the U.S. to talk about, about the issue and to promote those things. 2, we have our own book, which is dealing with the pastoral implications of the Pope's statements and Vatican's position on nukes. And I think that's going to be a groundbreaking book. We hope it will be a groundbreaking book. We have a lot of really good people writing. And then another one of my colleagues, Marianne Kusman Love from Catholic U, is doing a book that we are supporting on the role of religion and morality in the nuclear debate. And she's going around and interviewing all these people, the muckety-mucks in the nuclear policy debate, about their perspective on the role of religion and morality in the nuclear debate, and I'm really looking forward to that. It'll be a really interesting book and the kind of thing that hasn't been done in the way she's doing it, by actually interviewing a lot of these key decision makers. And then we have the fellowship I just mentioned, where we're bringing people in and saying you got to focus on nukes. Finally, what about the policy engagement and bishops and the like? We've had a series of major conferences starting at Stanford. We had a big one in London where we brought in a lot of European bishops, all the major bishops' conferences of Europe. The Vatican was represented there, and a lot of major scholars and policymakers from Europe and the United States. Then we supported the Vatican Conference. We're going to do something at Georgetown, we hope, that's aligned with the Pope's visit to Japan in November, which was just announced the end of November around Thanksgiving. The Pope's going to go to Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and you can expect, I think, a major statement on nuclear weapons at that time. That'll be a good opportunity to follow up with something at your parish. But we'll do something in Washington on that's kind of get the attention of policymakers. So those are the kinds of things that we've been doing through this initiative to revitalize the conversation. And on the student thing, the person we just hired to staff this initiative is a former high school teacher, so she's really keen on developing curricular materials for high schools. So we might do that down the road too.
Thank you. Any more questions? Last idea here. Jim is over here, wait.
This is a question for Ralph, and you can chime in afterwards too, Jerry, if you got any comments. Part of the storyline for nuclear deterrence is we are rational beings and we make rational decisions. I don't think there's any historical or scientific basis for that, but the issue we haven't really covered is accidental things that have happened, or what is the history of some of the accidents that have happened, and what are the risks for some of the ones that we know can happen?
I guess I'd start by saying late January of 1990, I think it was 96, it might have been 95, on January the 25th, I don't know where you were at that time. Probably a few of us could pinpoint on a date like that unless it was your birthday or something horrendous happened. It almost was a date that all of us who survived would have remembered, because a rocket carrying a weather satellite was launched from Norway. And following all the NATO procedures, Norway had notified Russia that this was going to be launched and it would travel through their airspace while it gained altitude to go into orbit. But that message didn't get through. There was a communication breakdown. And on Russian radar, it indicated a missile with the speed and trajectory of an intercontinental ballistic missile had just left Norway. Was it nuclear armed? Was it the first salvo attack? Was it something else? They had no way of knowing that. If you play that out in your mind, we have this idea of there's a red phone in the White House and a red phone in the Kremlin, these hotlines, and then you think, well, what would that conversation be like when the one president calls the other and says, did you just fire a nuclear missile at us? Well, if we hadn't, of course, we would say, no, we didn't fire a nuclear missile. If we had, we would say, no, we didn't fire a nuclear missile, right? I mean, what would be the point of undermining our own attack? So they didn't even try that. What happened was Brezhnev convened as many people as he could from his Kremlin. It was Bruce Blair at the Brookings Institute that did the write-up of this, I think, in the New England Journal of Medicine, after the files were declassified or released, made public. And what he learned was that the Kremlin's protocol was remarkably like the protocol in the United States in terms of decision making. Basically, it boiled down to they had 14 minutes to decide from when they estimated the time of launch to when they could be sure that they could get their weapons off the ground in their response, which is, of course, the first goal is to counterattack. So the clock ticked down to about 4 minutes in the Kremlin when Brezhnev just decided not to launch. He just decided not to launch. And Bruce Blair couldn't find anybody who could explain why that was. But that was one of a series of, I think it's almost 24, what they call near misses. Incidents, accidents, could be computer error, could be human error, could be miscommunications, involving both the United States and Russia over the last 30 years, where we have literally walked up to the brink of the abyss. And it's hard to talk about those things because they're real and they could happen at any moment. If we lived in Hawaii, we would be having an entirely different ambiance to our discussions today. And I have often said if what happened on January 13th, 2018 in Hawaii had happened in Los Angeles, I'm not sure we in the peace movement would be sitting around saying, how do we get people interested in nuclear weapons anymore? Because they had 34 minutes of terror. When they were told on their phones, every single person there was told, this is not a drill, we're under attack, there are incoming missiles. And at about 23 minutes, Tulsi Gabbard, I don't know if she's still a candidate or not, but she got the word and tweeted out to her followers, no, it won't. But many other people didn't get it for 34 minutes. parents put their kids in culverts. And later, I went to look. I actually talked to people who knew folks in Hawaii and said, I feel like we should get some money and go over there with the camera and start to interview people to document what do you do when you really think you're spending your last 30 minutes on Earth. But I didn't have the capacity to do that, as it turned out. But GQ magazine, of all places, GQ magazine had the capacity and did it. And if you go back and dig up their April issue, you'll read some amazing stories of people. You know, a woman on an emergency response team who jumped in her car and went tearing off to the, before she got a tweet from her boss saying, "Don't come in." Maybe the sanest thing anybody said the whole time, really, in the despair. And then returning home, she realized that she had just left her family. When the moment came, she just left her family out of this sense of duty. So even unpacking the aftermath of that. But here's the thing, the reports that came out following that said a false alarm in Hawaii. It wasn't. The alarm was real, and it should be real. We are all within 30 to 45 minutes of destruction. It was a false alert. It wasn't happening at that moment. But it could happen at any moment. It could happen to us. This could be the afternoon. Likely we won't know it when it happens to us. But I think that's the reality, the context for this entire discussion, and whether or not we feel a sense of urgency is whether or not we get it, I think. If we lived in Hawaii, we'd get it.
And this is where, you know, the folks like former Defense Secretary Kerry and company who are calling for disarmament, this is really one of their starting points. Part of it is terrorism and loose nukes that they're worried about, but this is the other. Because they've been on the inside during some of these crises, and then of course you got the Cuban Missile Crisis, which everybody knows about, but they're very concerned about accidental use of nuclear weapons and misperceptions and all that, because they understand how good the systems are or how good they are not. And this gets to, I think, a larger question that undergirds the whole nuclear debate. It's a question about, you know, the role of human reason, human nature, and the like. And, you know, the critics of the Pope and others who are calling for nuclear disarmament say, well, you don't get it. You know, we can't disinvent these things, right? We know how to make them. We can't disinvent them. So, like the poor, nukes will always be with us. So just get used to it. And the good news is, nuclear deterrence works. How do we know? We haven't had it. You know, Hiroshima and Nagasaki are the only times that nukes have been used. We've had tens of thousands of them around. Yeah, we've had some mishaps, accidents, Cuban Missile Crises, but the bottom line is we've avoided nuclear war and a major war, conventional war, in terms of anything like World War I or World War II. For some 7 decades, we should celebrate the fact. The good news is they work. The problem is that what we had was a very unstable piece of a sword during that time, and that's good. Piece of a sword's better than nuclear war or World War III, for sure. But they basically are being very idealistic and utopian, the realists are, because it really is idealistic to say that these fail-safe systems that are in place, and that rational actors like the North Korea's dictator and Donald Trump are somehow going to be able to overcome human frailty, ignorance, miscalculation, and, you know, original sin. You know, basically they want to revise or repeal original sin. And so I don't usually appeal to Wall Street for advice on anything important, but, you know, we might listen to the disclaimer that past performance is no guarantee of future results, and not expect that what we've been lucky as can be has worked, and avoiding a nuclear war is going to continue to work. And finally, I think most important is, you know, this goes back to the question we had earlier about the fear, mentality of fear. That's a common theme in all the papal statements for a long time about deterrence. That its bottom line is it's based on a mentality of fear that we can't accept. And also, Jonathan Schell talks about the profound fatalism that undergirds the whole nuclear predicament in our deterrence strategy. And both that mentality of fear and this profound fatalism, they really deny human agency and choice and control in a way that really reflects the sin of despair, right? If you're saying that human beings are just stuck with this predicament, we created it, but we can't do anything to get us out of it, that really is, you could argue, the sin of despair. Because you're just being fatalistic and you're just living out of fear. And it certainly isn't a faith-based perspective. So the challenge is to convince the realists that it's not utopian to say we can move toward nuclear disarmament. And we have to do our homework and convince them that that cure, disarmament, is better than the disease of deterrence.
Thank you.
So could I just say one other thing? I just
Sure.
want to add on to that. When we discuss nuclear weapons in political terms and deterrence, or we discuss nuclear weapons in moral terms, and in fact, with the possible exception of the current occupant of the White House, who I think is a fundamentally immoral or amoral person, every president has wrestled with the morality of nuclear weapons. And even Truman, before and after he made the decision, felt he needed to justify it on moral terms. And every president has thought about that, and Kennedy thought about it during the Cuban Missile Crisis. So the part of the debate that we want to engage, it may be that the technical politicians don't want to talk about the morality of it, but it is inextricably part of the conversation about nuclear weapons. I say that. And the other thing I wanted to say is that when the discussion focuses on policies of deterrence or things like that, what it overlooks is, since 1945, we've spent over $5 trillion of our common treasury on nuclear weapons. We have fought wars in which we lost, or at least came to a draw, in Korea. We did win Grenada, but Vietnam and and Iraq and Afghanistan, and we didn't use our nuclear weapons. They don't deter war itself. They deter other nuclear attack. They're useless in a conventional war, and they have cost us $5 trillion. And I don't know about your town, but we have people sleeping underneath the overpass in Knoxville. So I think it's really short-sighted to take any one part of the discussion, as both of us have for a lot of today, and pick that apart without looking at the entire context. This is a big issue and a big challenge. I think we're up to it, but I do think we have to recognize the enormity of what it is that we're trying to do and work together to accomplish it.
Thank you very much.
Okay, with that, I'd like to thank the panel and the moderator. The next